Hey guys, tonight we're exploring why nobody wanted to be skinny in Victorian England. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy relaxing history videos for sleep. Now, settle in and let's travel back to the middle of the 19th century. Imagine walking through the streets of London in the 1850s. Today, many people see being thin as desirable. But in Victorian England, the opposite was often true. A fuller body was usually viewed as a sign of health, comfort, and prosperity. If someone appeared very thin, people might assume they were poor, sick, or struggling to find enough food. For many working-class families, daily meals were simple and limited. Bread, potatoes, and inexpensive foods made up much of their diet. Meat was often a luxury rather than an everyday meal. Because food could be expensive, carrying extra weight suggested that a person had access to plenty of nourishment. Wealthy families, on the other hand, enjoyed large dinners filled with roasted meats, puddings, cheeses, and rich desserts. Their appearance reflected their ability to afford such abundance. Victorian beauty standards reflected these ideas as well. Women with soft features, rounded faces, and healthy-looking figures were often considered attractive. Paintings, photographs, and magazines frequently presented this image as the ideal. Men were expected to look strong and respectable, and a fuller build often suggested success and authority. Medical knowledge was still limited during this period. Many serious illnesses caused dramatic weight loss, so thinness could be associated with poor health. If a neighbour suddenly became very skinny, people might worry that something was wrong. As a result, looking well-fed was often seen as reassuring and desirable. Even family portraits were carefully arranged to display dignity, stability, and social status. Yet by the end of the Victorian era, attitudes slowly began to change. New fashions, changing lifestyles, and developing medical ideas started to reshape how people thought about body weight and beauty, setting the stage for the modern ideals that would emerge in the century to come. As Victorian society grew wealthier during the second half of the 19th century, food became more available to many families. Railways connected cities and countryside like never before, allowing fresh products to travel greater distances. Markets filled with vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and meats that would have been difficult to obtain only a generation earlier. For the growing middle class, a generous dinner table became an important way to demonstrate success. Hosting guests was not simply about sharing a meal. It was a public display of status. The more courses served, the more impressive the household appeared. Visitors often judged a family's prosperity by what was placed on the table and how it was presented. Rich sauces, elaborate puddings, and large portions signalled comfort and security in a world where many people still struggled to make ends meet. Victorian magazines sometimes published advice on health and appearance, but the recommendations were very different from modern fitness guides. Rather than encouraging weight loss, many articles focused on maintaining strength, energy, and a healthy complexion. Pale skin and a weak frame could suggest illness. A person with rosy cheeks and a fuller figure appeared healthier and more attractive in the eyes of many observers. For women, fashion also played a major role. Dresses were designed to create a particular silhouette, often emphasizing curves rather than hiding them. Layers of fabric, petticoats, and carefully tailored garments helped create the fashionable shape of the era. Beauty was not measured by how slim someone looked. Instead, elegance was often associated with grace, confidence, and a well-nourished appearance. Men faced their own expectations. Successful businessmen, politicians, and landowners were frequently portrayed as sturdy and substantial. A larger body could symbolize authority and stability. In portraits, these men often appeared serious and dignified, projecting an image of power that matched Victorian ideas about leadership and respectability. Yet beneath these ideals, life was changing rapidly. Factories expanded, cities grew, and scientific discoveries transformed everyday life. Doctors gradually learned more about nutrition and disease. As the century moved toward its final decades, some people began paying closer attention to exercise and physical fitness. New ideas about health slowly challenged older assumptions, while a fuller figure remained desirable for many Victorians. The first signs of a changing attitude were beginning to appear. Those changes would eventually reshape beauty standards in ways few people of the era could have imagined. By the late Victorian period, changing attitudes toward health began to influence how people thought about body weight. Doctors and scientists were studying the human body more carefully than ever before. Newspapers regularly reported on new medical discoveries, and educated families eagerly followed these developments. Although most people still associated a fuller figure with prosperity, some began to question whether carrying too much weight was always beneficial. At the same time, industrialization was transforming daily life. Many wealthy Victorians no longer performed physically demanding work. Business owners, lawyers, and office workers often spent long hours sitting indoors. As a result, concerns about inactivity slowly emerged. Some health writers started recommending walking, cycling, and outdoor recreation as ways to maintain vigour and vitality. These ideas were especially appealing to the growing middle class, which had more leisure time than previous generations. The invention of the safety bicycle in the late 19th century became a cultural phenomenon. Men and women alike embraced cycling as both transportation and exercise. For perhaps the first time, large numbers of ordinary people began viewing physical activity as an important part of a healthy lifestyle, rather than simply a necessity of labour. This shift subtly influenced beauty standards. While extreme thinness was still unpopular, a more active and balanced appearance gradually gained admiration. Another factor was the rise of photography. Unlike painted portraits, photographs captured people with greater realism. Families could now see themselves more accurately, and public figures appeared in newspapers and magazines across the country. As photographs became widespread, ideas about appearance spread more quickly than ever before. Fashion trends that originated in London could soon influence people throughout Britain and beyond. Meanwhile, the British Empire connected Victorian England to distant parts of the world. New foods, products, and cultural influences arrived from overseas. Tea, sugar, spices, and other imported goods became deeply woven into everyday life. Abundant food remained a symbol of comfort, but growing awareness of health encouraged moderation in some circles. Social class continued to shape perceptions of body weight. Wealthy families could afford varied diets and medical care, while poor families often faced overcrowded housing and limited nutrition. As a result, appearance still carried powerful social meaning. A person's body could reveal clues about their economic circumstances long before they spoke a single word. Yet, as the 19th century drew to a close, Victorian society stood on the edge of enormous change. New technologies, new scientific theories, and new cultural values were preparing to reshape the very definition of beauty, health, and success in the modern age. As the 20th century approached, many Victorian traditions began to face challenges from a rapidly changing world. Cities were becoming larger, transportation was improving, and information travelled faster than ever before. What had once been considered unquestionable, social wisdom was now being examined through the lens of science and modern thinking. Ideas about food, health, and the human body were among the subjects undergoing transformation. Doctors increasingly studied nutrition and the effects of different diets, while earlier generations often viewed a larger body as evidence of prosperity. Medical professionals started paying attention to the potential consequences of excessive eating and sedentary lifestyles. These discussions remained limited at first, but they planted the seeds for future changes in public opinion. At the same time, Victorian dining culture remained remarkably elaborate. Wealthy households often employed cooks and servants who prepared meals consisting of multiple courses. A formal dinner might begin with soup, followed by fish, meat dishes, vegetables, desserts, fruit, and coffee. Such meals could last for hours. Guests were expected to follow strict rules of etiquette, using the correct utensils and observing proper manners throughout the evening. Food was not merely nourishment. It was entertainment, status, and social performance combined into one event. For many affluent Victorians, displaying abundance was still an important way to demonstrate success. Yet beyond the grand dining rooms of the upper classes, millions of ordinary people experienced a very different reality. Factory workers often laboured for long hours and consumed simple meals designed to provide energy rather than luxury. In crowded urban neighbourhoods, families stretched their budgets carefully to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. The contrast between rich and poor remained one of the defining features of Victorian society. Interestingly, advertisements began playing a larger role in shaping public perceptions. Newspapers promoted tonics, health remedies, and special foods that promised strength, beauty, and vitality. Some products claimed to help thin individuals gain weight and achieve a healthier appearance. These advertisements reveal just how different Victorian beauty standards were from many modern ideals. Being too thin was often considered undesirable rather than fashionable. Literature of the period also reflected these attitudes. Novelists frequently described wealthy or influential characters as robust and well-fed, while poverty was often associated with gaunt faces and fragile bodies. Readers understood these descriptions immediately because they matched the assumptions of their society. Physical appearance carried social meaning that extended far beyond simple attractiveness. It communicated class, health, opportunity, and even moral character. As the Victorian era entered its final years, however, younger generations were beginning to embrace new ideas. Sports clubs, recreational activities, and organised athletics became increasingly popular. The belief that regular exercise could improve both physical and mental well-being gained supporters across Britain. These trends would continue to grow, gradually changing how people viewed the ideal human body and preparing society for the dramatic cultural shifts of the new century. The growth of organised sports accelerated these changes. Football clubs, rowing teams, cycling groups, and athletic societies attracted thousands of participants across Britain. Physical fitness was no longer viewed solely as something necessary for soldiers or labourers. It was increasingly seen as a valuable goal for ordinary citizens. Newspapers celebrated athletic achievements, and successful sportsmen became admired public figures. As a result, strength and mobility slowly gained importance, alongside the traditional Victorian preference for a well-fed appearance. Schools also began placing greater emphasis on physical education. Young boys were encouraged to participate in games and outdoor activities that built endurance and discipline. These experiences helped shape a generation that viewed health differently from their parents and grandparents. While few people were trying to become extremely thin, many were starting to appreciate the benefits of staying active and maintaining physical fitness. Women experienced changes as well. Toward the end of the Victorian era, some women gained greater opportunities to participate in recreational activities. Cycling became especially popular because it offered both exercise and a sense of independence. This cultural shift influenced fashion, leading to clothing that was sometimes more practical and comfortable than earlier Victorian styles. As movement became more important in everyday life, ideas about the ideal female figure slowly evolved. Despite these developments, most Victorians would still be surprised by modern attitudes toward body image. The obsession with counting calories, following strict diets, or pursuing extreme thinness would have seemed strange to many of them. In their world, food represented security, and a healthy appetite was often considered a positive trait. The memory of poverty and hunger remained powerful, especially among families who had experienced difficult economic times. Looking prosperous was not simply about vanity. It reflected survival, stability, and success. By the time Queen Victoria's reign ended in 1901, Britain had changed enormously from the country she began ruling as a young queen. New technologies, new scientific knowledge, and new social values were reshaping society. The old belief that a fuller figure automatically represented the ideal was gradually fading, but it had not disappeared entirely. The transition would continue into the 20th century, where changing fashions, modern medicine, and mass media would create entirely new standards of beauty and health. As the new century began, many Victorian customs slowly became part of history, but their influence did not disappear overnight. Families who had spent generations believing that a fuller body represented comfort and success did not suddenly change their minds. Cultural values often move slowly, and the ideas formed during Queen Victoria's reign continued to shape society for years. Grand family dinners remained important gatherings where relatives celebrated holidays, discussed business, and strengthened social connections. Food still carried deep emotional meaning. It represented hospitality, generosity, and security. Offering guests plenty to eat was considered a sign of respect and kindness, even among ordinary households. Serving a satisfying meal to family members was a source of pride. These traditions reflected a world where memories of scarcity were never far away. Historians studying Victorian England often point out that beauty standards are never fixed. They change according to a society's economy, technology, and daily experiences. In a time when many people worried about hunger, a well-fed appearance seemed attractive. In later eras, when food became more abundant, different ideals emerged. This reminds us that what people consider beautiful is often connected to much larger social forces. Looking back today, it is easy to assume that modern attitudes toward body image have always existed. Yet the Victorians would likely find many of our beliefs surprising. They lived in a world where prosperity could be seen in a person's appearance, where a hearty appetite was often praised, and where being too thin could raise concerns rather than admiration. Their perspective was shaped by the realities of their time. Understanding these differences helps us see history in a more human way. The people of Victorian England were not so different from us. They wanted health, happiness, respect, and security for themselves and their families. They simply lived in a society with different experiences and different expectations. And that is why, for many Victorians, being skinny was not a goal at all. It was often something people hoped to avoid. One of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian England is how ordinary people rarely questioned these beliefs. A young person growing up during the era would have been surrounded by the same messages from family members, neighbours, magazines, and even doctors. If respected adults believed that a fuller figure reflected health and prosperity, that idea naturally became part of everyday life. Most people simply accepted it as common sense. In many households, parents encouraged children to eat well and maintain a healthy appearance. A child who looked thin might cause concern among relatives, who could worry that the family was struggling financially, or that the child was suffering from an illness. These concerns were understandable. In a period when infectious diseases remained common and medical treatments were limited, looking healthy was often considered a form of protection against the uncertainties of life. The Victorian era was also a time of impressive economic growth, but that prosperity was not shared equally. While wealthy families enjoyed luxurious meals and comfortable homes, millions of workers faced difficult conditions. Long hours in factories, mines, and workshops demanded enormous physical effort. For these labourers, food was not simply a pleasure. It was fuel needed to survive demanding days of work. A strong body could mean the difference between earning a wage and falling into poverty. Because of this reality, physical size often carried practical significance as well as social meaning. Another reason Victorian attitudes seem unusual today is that people were exposed to far fewer images than modern audiences. There was no television, no internet, and no social media constantly promoting new beauty trends. Most people compared themselves to those in their local communities rather than to celebrities from around the world. As a result, beauty standards changed more slowly and remained closely connected to local culture. Modern society often experiences rapid shifts in fashion and appearance because information travels instantly. Victorian society moved at a different pace. Traditions lasted longer, and established beliefs held greater influence over daily life. This stability helped preserve ideas about body image for decades. Yet, even during this period, opinions were never completely identical. Some individuals preferred slimmer figures, while others admired larger ones. Human preferences have always varied. What makes Victorian England interesting is that the broader culture generally leaned toward associating fullness with success and security. As we continue exploring this world, we discover that something as simple as body weight can reveal surprising details about economics, medicine, family life, and social values. It shows how deeply everyday experiences shape what people consider normal, attractive, and desirable. By the final years of the Victorian era, Britain had become one of the most powerful nations in the world. Its ships travelled across oceans. Its factories produced enormous quantities of goods, and its cities continued to expand. Yet despite all this progress, daily life for ordinary people still revolved around simple concerns such as work, food, family, and health. These everyday realities shaped how Victorians viewed the human body. A person's appearance often served as a visible summary of their circumstances. Someone who looked healthy and well-fed was assumed to be living a comfortable life, while a thin and exhausted appearance could suggest hardship. These assumptions were not always accurate, but they were deeply rooted in society. Victorian literature provides many examples of this mindset. Authors frequently described wealthy characters as substantial and impressive, while poor characters were often portrayed as thin, worn out, and physically weakened by difficult living conditions. Readers immediately understood these descriptions because they reflected familiar social patterns. Physical appearance acted almost like a form of social language. Without speaking a word, a person's body could communicate clues about wealth, occupation, and lifestyle. Say Victorian. Fascination with respectability also influenced attitudes toward weight. Respectability was one of the most important social values of the age. It involved behaving properly, dressing appropriately, maintaining a good reputation, and presenting oneself in a dignified manner. Looking healthy and prosperous supported this image. Families worked hard to demonstrate that they were responsible members of society, and physical appearance played a role in that effort. Portrait photography became increasingly popular during this period. Families saved money to have photographs taken, often wearing their best clothing and adopting serious expressions. These images were intended to preserve a respectable image for future generations. Looking frail or unhealthy in such portraits was generally undesirable. Instead, people wanted to appear stable, confident, and successful. Food itself carried powerful symbolism. Large meals were associated with celebration, achievement, and hospitality. Holidays, weddings, and family gatherings often centered around impressive feasts. Serving generous portions demonstrated generosity and abundance. In a world where previous generations had experienced hunger and uncertainty, the ability to provide plentiful food represented a meaningful accomplishment. Looking back today, it becomes clear that Victorian ideas about body weight were connected to much more than beauty. They reflected economic conditions, medical knowledge, cultural values, and collective memories. Understanding these attitudes helps us appreciate how dramatically societies can change over time, and how future generations may one day view our own beauty standards with the same curiosity that we bring to the Victorians. As the Victorian age faded into history, many of its values continued to influence the generations that followed. Grandparents who had spent their entire lives believing that a fuller body represented health and prosperity passed those ideas on to their children and grandchildren. Cultural beliefs rarely disappear overnight. Instead, they slowly evolve as society changes around them. This gradual transition can be seen clearly in attitudes toward food and appearance during the early 20th century. Even as new medical research emerged, many families continued to view a hearty appetite as a sign of strength. Mothers often worried if their children seemed too thin or refused meals. Family recipes were treasured and passed down through generations, with rich puddings, breads, pies, and roasted meats remaining central to many households. Food was more than nourishment. It was comfort, tradition, and a reminder of family stability. Victorian values also influenced the way people thought about work. Hard labour was respected, and a healthy body was often seen as evidence of discipline and reliability. Employers frequently preferred workers who appeared strong and capable of handling long hours. Physical appearance could affect opportunities in ways that seem surprising today. Looking healthy suggested that a person was dependable and able to meet the demands of daily life. Another important factor was life expectancy. During much of the Victorian period, diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid fever posed serious threats. Many families experienced the loss of loved ones at young ages. In such an environment, signs of physical health were highly valued. Personen visal, healthy complexion, and a well-fed appearance seemed better equipped to withstand the dangers of the era. This helps explain why thinness often carried negative associations. It was not simply a matter of beauty. It could remind people of sickness, hardship, and vulnerability. The Victorian world was also filled with social expectations. Men were expected to appear respectable providers, while women were expected to embody grace and domestic stability. Appearance played a role in meeting these expectations. Clothing, posture, manners, and body shape all contributed to the image a person presented to society. Because reputation mattered greatly, many people paid close attention to how they were perceived by others. Today, historians study these attitudes not because body weight itself is unusual, but because it reveals so much about the society that produced those beliefs. Through something as simple as the ideal body type, we can learn about economics, medicine, family life, fashion, and social class. The Victorian preference for fuller figures tells a larger story about a world where abundance was admired, security was treasured, and health could never be taken for granted. Understanding these perspectives allows us to step inside the minds of people who lived more than a century ago and see the world through their eyes. By the beginning of the 20th century, the world that Victorians had known was changing rapidly. New inventions appeared almost every year. Electric lights replaced gas lamps in many cities. Telephones connected people across long distances, and modern transportation made travel faster than previous. Generations could have imagined. These developments slowly transformed everyday life, including the way people thought about health and appearance. Younger generations were growing up in a society that looked very different from the one their grandparents had known. Yet many Victorian habits remained surprisingly strong. Families still gathered around large meals, respected traditional manners, and valued the appearance of health and stability. In many relatives continued to share stories about difficult times when food was scarce and hard work was necessary for survival. These memories influenced how people viewed body weight for years to come. A well-fed appearance still carried positive associations, especially among those who remembered economic hardships. Historians often note that beauty standards are shaped by the challenges people face. During the Victorian era, hunger, disease, and poverty were real concerns for millions of families. Because of this, signs of comfort and abundance became desirable. What modern people sometimes view as excess was often interpreted very differently by Victorians. To them, a fuller figure could symbolize success, security, and good fortune. This perspective reminds us that beauty is never defined by nature alone. It is shaped by culture, experience, and circumstance. Fashion also continued to evolve. As clothing styles changed, people began presenting themselves in new ways. The heavy layers and strict silhouettes of earlier decades gradually gave way to more practical designs. These changes encouraged different ideas about movement, activity, and physical appearance. Society was slowly preparing for a new century with new expectations. Looking back today, the Victorian preference for fuller bodies may seem unusual, but it makes perfect sense when viewed within the context of the time. Their beliefs were connected to the realities of daily life, the limits of medical knowledge, and the economic conditions surrounding them. Understanding these attitudes helps us recognize that every generation develops its own standards based on its unique experiences. Victorians were not trying to follow trends. They were responding to the world they lived in, and through their attitudes toward food, health, and appearance, we gain a fascinating glimpse into what mattered most in one of history's most remarkable eras. As Britain moved further into the 20th century, historians began looking back at the Victorian era with great fascination. Many of the customs that Victorians considered perfectly normal seemed unusual to later generations. Their attitudes toward body weight became one of the clearest examples of how social values can change over time. What one generation sees as attractive, another may view completely differently. This constant evolution reminds us that beauty standards are never permanent. They reflect the priorities and experiences of a particular society at a particular moment in history. For Victorians, security was one of life's greatest goals. The 19th century was filled with uncertainty. Economic downturns could leave families without income. Diseases could spread rapidly through crowded cities. Harsh winters and poor harvests could affect food supplies. In such a world, signs of comfort and abundance carried enormous importance. A person who appeared healthy and well-fed seemed protected from many of the dangers surrounding them. This belief influenced not only beauty standards but also social attitudes. family expectations, and personal ambitions. The Victorian emphasis on appearance was closely tied to reputation. Respectability was considered one of the highest virtues. People wanted neighbours, employers, and relatives to view them as responsible and successful. Clothing, manners, speech, and physical appearance all contributed to this image. Looking healthy was often interpreted as evidence that a person managed their life properly, because society placed such value on reputation. Even small details of appearance could attract attention and judgment. It is also important to remember that Victorian England was not a single, uniform society. Experiences varied greatly depending on social class, location, and occupation. Wealthy families living in elegant London neighbourhoods experienced life very differently from factory workers in industrial cities or farmers in rural villages. Yet, despite these differences, the association between fullness and prosperity appeared across much of society. It was a shared cultural idea that connected people from many backgrounds. Today, when we examine Victorian attitudes toward body weight, we are really exploring something much larger. We are learning how people understood health, success, and happiness in their own time. Their beliefs reveal the hopes and fears that shaped everyday life. They remind us that history is not just about kings, wars, and famous events. It is also about ordinary people and the values that guided their daily decisions. Through something as simple as changing ideas about appearance, we gain a deeper understanding of how Victorians saw themselves and the world around them. Another reason these ideas remained so powerful was that Victorians often connected physical appearance with moral character. In their view, a person who maintained a respectable appearance demonstrated self-control, responsibility, and discipline. Society frequently judged people based on first impressions, and appearance became a visible symbol of personal success, while modern observers may separate body shape from character. Many Victorians saw a strong connection between the two. This belief influenced how people interacted with one another in workplaces, social gatherings, and even potential marriages. Marriage itself was an important part of Victorian life, and appearance often played a role in finding a suitable partner. Families paid close attention to reputation, social standing, and health. A healthy-looking individual was generally considered more desirable because they appeared capable of building a stable future. Since illness was common and medical treatments were limited, physical health carried significant importance. Looking well-fed and energetic suggested that a person possessed the strength needed to face life's challenges. Victorian magazines and advice books regularly discuss proper behaviour, household management, and personal presentation. Readers were encouraged to maintain cleanliness, good manners, and a respectable appearance. These publications helped spread common ideas throughout the country. Even people living far from major cities could learn about the values and expectations shaping broader society. As a result, certain beliefs about health and body image became deeply embedded in everyday culture. Children grew up hearing these messages from an early age. Parents taught them the importance of proper conduct, good nutrition, and maintaining the family's reputation. Many young people accepted these values without questioning them because they were reinforced at home, at school, and in the community. Cultural beliefs often become strongest when they are repeated across multiple parts of daily life, and Victorian attitudes toward appearance provide a perfect example of this process. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to forget how different Victorian realities were. Food shortages, infectious diseases, and economic uncertainty shaped their understanding of health in ways that are difficult for many people today to imagine. Their preference for fuller figures was not simply a matter of fashion. It reflected deeper concerns about survival, stability, and social respectability. Every generation develops standards that seem natural at the time. Yet those standards often change dramatically as society evolves. The story of Victorian body image, therefore, tells us something important about history itself. People's beliefs are shaped by the conditions in which they live. As those conditions change, ideas about beauty, success, and health change as well. The Victorians left behind a fascinating example of how cultural values can influence even the most personal aspects of everyday life, revealing a world that was both familiar and surprisingly different from our own. As the Victorian era came to an end, many people could not have imagined how dramatically the world would change in the decades ahead. New scientific discoveries would transform medicine. New technologies would reshape communication. And new social movements would challenge long-established traditions. Yet, for all these changes, the Victorian belief that appearance reflected a person's circumstances left a lasting mark on society. The connection between health, prosperity, and physical appearance remained influential long after Queen Victoria's reign had ended. One fascinating aspect of Victorian life was how closely communities observed one another. In many neighbourhoods, people knew their neighbours well and paid attention to their daily habits. Changes in appearance rarely went unnoticed. If someone suddenly lost a significant amount of weight, friends and relatives might become concerned. They could suspect illness, financial trouble, or personal hardship. In this way, body weight was often viewed not simply as a personal matter, but as a reflection of broader life circumstances. The Victorian home also played an important role in reinforcing these ideas. Family meals were central to daily life, and parents often took pride in providing plentiful food for their children. A well-stocked table represented more than material comfort. It demonstrated care, responsibility, and success as a provider. Many family traditions revolved around food, from Sunday dinners to holiday celebrations. These gatherings strengthened the association between abundance and happiness. Religious values influenced society as well. Many Victorians believed that gratitude, moderation, and hard work were important virtues, while excessive indulgence was sometimes criticised. Enjoying the rewards of honest labour was generally accepted. A comfortable lifestyle earned through dedication and perseverance was often viewed positively. This outlook helped explain why visible signs of prosperity, including a healthy and well-fed appearance, were admired rather than criticised. As historians continue studying Victorian England, they often emphasise that beauty standards are windows into larger social realities. The preference for fuller figures was not an isolated fashion trend. It reflected concerns about health, food security, and social respectability. every belief was connected to the conditions people experienced in their everyday lives. When we compare Victorian ideals to modern ones, we discover that neither is permanent or universal. Standards change because societies change. What seems obvious to one generation may appear unusual to another. The Victorians could not predict how future generations would think about body image, just as we cannot fully predict how attitudes may evolve in the future. Their story reminds us that ideas about beauty are deeply tied to history itself, shaped by the hopes, challenges, and experiences of the people who live through each era. Perhaps the most interesting lesson from Victorian England is that people rarely realise they are living inside a unique period of history. To the Victorians, their beliefs about health and appearance seemed completely normal. They did not wake up each morning thinking they were following a particular beauty standard. They simply accepted the values that surrounded them. Family members, teachers, newspapers, churches, and neighbours all reinforced similar ideas, creating a shared understanding of what it meant to look healthy and respectable. This is one reason historians find everyday life so fascinating. Major events such as wars, elections, and royal ceremonies are important, but the ordinary habits of daily life often reveal even more about a society. The Victorian preference for Fuller figures tells us about food supplies, medical knowledge, social expectations, and economic conditions all at the same time. A single cultural belief can open a window into an entire world. Imagine walking through a busy Victorian street in London. Horse-drawn carriages move along the roads. Shopkeepers display goods in their windows. Workers hurry to factories while wealthy gentlemen discuss business over lunch. Everywhere you look, people are making judgments based on appearance. Clothing, posture, manners, and physical condition all communicate information. In a society where reputation mattered greatly, appearance became a kind of social language understood by nearly everyone. The passage of time would eventually transform these attitudes. Advances in medicine reduced the fear of many diseases. Improvements in agriculture and transportation made food more available. New forms of entertainment and mass media introduced different ideas about beauty. As society changed, so did the standards people used to evaluate themselves and others. What had once symbolised prosperity gradually lost some of its meaning as abundance became more common. Yet even today, traces of Victorian thinking can still be found. Many people continue to associate appearance with success, health, or personal character. While the specific standards may have changed, the tendency to draw conclusions from physical appearance remains surprisingly familiar. This reminds us that history is never completely separate from the present. The beliefs of earlier generations often leave lasting influences that continue long after the original circumstances have disappeared. As we look back on Victorian England, we see a society shaped by its own challenges, opportunities, and expectations. Their attitudes toward body weight may seem unusual from a modern perspective, but they made sense within the world the Victorians knew. By understanding those perspectives, we gain a deeper appreciation not only of their lives, but also of how culture shapes the way every generation defines beauty, health, and success. By the early decades of the 20th century, many of the people who had grown up during Queen Victoria's reign were becoming elderly. They carried with them memories of a very different Britain, a country where horse-drawn carriages filled the streets. Letters travelled slowly across the nation, and social customs were governed by strict expectations. These older generations often shared stories with their children and grandchildren, passing down not only family history but also the values that had shaped their lives. Among those values was the belief that a healthy appearance reflected stability, prosperity, and good fortune. For many Victorians, life had been filled with uncertainty. Employment was not always guaranteed. Medical treatments were limited, and economic hardship could arrive unexpectedly. In such an environment, visible signs of comfort provided reassurance. A well-fed appearance suggested that a person had access to food, shelter, and resources. It symbolised security in a world where security could never be taken for granted. This helps explain why physical appearance carried such strong social meaning. See Victorian. Fascination with respectability extended into nearly every aspect of daily life. Homes were carefully maintained. Clothing was selected with great attention, and manners were considered extremely important. Individuals were expected to present themselves in a way that reflected positively on their families. Personal appearance became part of this larger effort. Looking healthy and respectable was viewed as evidence of good character and proper upbringing. As historians examine photographs from the Victorian period, they often notice how seriously people posed for portraits. Smiles were less common than they are today, and subjects frequently adopted formal expressions. These photographs were intended to communicate dignity, stability, and social standing. Families wanted future generations to remember them as respectable and successful members of society. Every detail, from clothing to posture, contributed to that image. At the same time, Victorian society was far more complex than simple stereotypes suggest. Not everyone shared identical opinions about beauty or health. Different regions, social classes, and families sometimes held different views. Yet the broader cultural tendency remained remarkably consistent. Fullness was generally associated with abundance, while thinness often raised concerns about health or economic hardship. When modern people study these attitudes, they gain insight into more than body image alone. They discover how economic conditions influence culture, how medical knowledge shapes public opinion, and how deeply social values can affect everyday life. The Victorian story reminds us that standards of beauty are never fixed. They are created by people responding to the world around them. As circumstances change, those standards change as well, leaving behind a fascinating record of how each generation understood itself. By the early decades of the 20th century, many of the people who had grown up during Queen Victoria's reign were becoming elderly. They carried with them memories of a very different Britain, a country where horse-drawn carriages filled the streets. Letters travelled slowly across the nation, and social customs were governed by strict expectations. These older generations often shared stories with their children and grandchildren, passing down not only family history but also the values that had shaped their lives. Among those values was the belief that a healthy appearance reflected stability, prosperity, and good fortune. For many Victorians, life had been filled with uncertainty. Employment was not always guaranteed. Medical treatments were limited, and economic hardship could arrive unexpectedly. In such an environment, visible signs of comfort provided reassurance. A well-fed appearance suggested that a person had access to food, shelter, and resources. It symbolized security in a world where security could never be taken for granted. This helps explain why physical appearance carried such strong social meaning. See Victorian. Fascination with respectability extended into nearly every aspect of daily life. Homes were carefully maintained. Clothing was selected with great attention, and manners were considered extremely important. Individuals were expected to present themselves in a way that reflected positively on their families. Personal appearance became part of this larger effort. Looking healthy and respectable was viewed as evidence of good character and proper upbringing. As historians examine photographs from the Victorian period, they often notice how seriously people posed for portraits. Smiles were less common than they are today, and subjects frequently adopted formal expressions. These photographs were intended to communicate dignity, stability, and social standing. Families wanted future generations to remember them as respectable and successful members of society. Every detail, from clothing to posture, contributed to that image. At the same time, Victorian society was far more complex than simple stereotypes suggest. Not everyone shared identical opinions about beauty or health. Different regions, social classes, and families sometimes held different views. Yet the broader cultural tendency remained remarkably consistent. Fullness was generally associated with abundance, while thinness often raised concerns about health or economic hardship. When modern people study these attitudes, they gain insight into more than body image alone. They discover how economic conditions influence culture, how medical knowledge shapes public opinion, and how deeply social values can affect everyday life. The Victorian story reminds us that standards of beauty are never fixed. They are created by people responding to the world around them. As circumstances change, those standards change as well, leaving behind a fascinating record of how each generation understood itself. As the years passed, the memory of Victorian life gradually became history. But historians never lost interest in understanding how people of that era viewed the world. One reason is that Victorian society stood at a crossroads between the old world and the modern age. Many traditional beliefs still shaped everyday life, yet new inventions and ideas were beginning to transform the future. The Victorian attitude toward body weight reflects this unique moment in history. It reveals a society balancing centuries-old assumptions with the first signs of modern thinking. In Victorian England, appearance often functioned as a visible record of a person's life circumstances. Before advanced medical tests or detailed financial records were available to ordinary people, individuals frequently relied on observation. They looked at clothing, posture, speech, and physical condition to form opinions about others. A person who appeared healthy and well-fed was often assumed to enjoy a comfortable life. Whether those assumptions were correct or not, they influenced social interactions every day. The importance of community also played a role. Victorian neighbourhoods were often closely connected. Families attended the same churches, visited the same shops, and knew many of the people living nearby. In such environments, reputations could spread quickly. Looking respectable mattered because people were constantly being observed by friends, relatives, employers, and neighbours. Physical appearance became one element of maintaining social standing within the community. Another fascinating detail is how different generations viewed these standards. Older Victorians sometimes held more traditional opinions, while younger people were increasingly exposed to new ideas through newspapers, books, and expanding educational opportunities. As society modernised, debates about health, exercise, and nutrition became more common. Some people embraced these changes enthusiastically, while others preferred familiar traditions. This tension between old and new ideas was a defining feature of the late Victorian period. Today, when we examine these historical attitudes, it becomes clear that beauty standards are deeply connected to larger social realities. They are shaped by economic conditions, scientific understanding, cultural traditions, and personal experiences. The Victorian preference for fuller figures was not simply a matter of taste. It reflected concerns about health, prosperity, survival, and respectability in a rapidly changing world. Perhaps that is why this topic remains so interesting. It reminds us that every society develops its own ideas about what is desirable, healthy, and attractive. Those ideas often seem natural to the people living at the time, yet they can appear surprising to future generations. By studying Victorian England, we gain a better understanding of how cultural values are created and how they evolve. In doing so, we learn not only about the Victorians themselves, but also about the powerful ways society shapes the beliefs we hold today. By the time historians began studying Victorian society in greater detail, they realised that attitudes toward body weight offered valuable clues about every life. Something as simple as the ideal body shape could reveal information about food availability, medical knowledge, social class, and cultural values. This is one reason why the Victorian era continues to fascinate researchers today. The preferences of ordinary people often tell us as much about history as major political events. For many Victorians, the goal was not to become thin or fashionable according to modern standards. Instead, they wanted to appear healthy, respectable, and secure. A comfortable appearance suggested that a person was successfully managing the challenges of life in a world where poverty and illness were common concerns. These qualities carried great importance. Looking prosperous was often seen as evidence that a family had achieved stability through hard work and good fortune. As society entered the modern age, many of these ideas slowly changed. Advances in medicine helped people better understand nutrition and disease. Improvements in living conditions reduced some of the fears that had shaped earlier generations. New forms of media introduced different images of beauty and success. Over time, public opinion shifted in directions that Victorians could never have predicted. Yet despite these changes, one thing remained the same. Human beings continued to judge themselves and others according to the standards of their own time. Just as Victorians believed their ideals were natural and sensible, modern societies often assume their own standards are normal as well. History teaches us that these beliefs are constantly evolving. What seems obvious in one century may appear unusual in the next. The story of Victorian body image, therefore, reveals something universal about human nature. People adapt their values to the conditions in which they live. Economic realities, health concerns, cultural traditions, and social expectations all influence how beauty is defined. The Victorians were no exception. Their preference for fuller figures reflected the world they knew and the challenges they faced. As we look back on their lives, we gain more than historical knowledge. We gain perspective. We begin to understand that beauty standards are not fixed rules but changing reflections of society itself. And through that understanding, the Victorian era becomes not just a chapter in history, but a reminder of how deeply culture shapes the way people see themselves and the world around them. Even after Victorian ideals began to fade, their influence could still be felt in many parts of society. Grandparents who had lived through the 19th century often shared their beliefs with younger family members. They remembered a time when having enough food on the table was never guaranteed, and when a healthy appearance could provide reassurance during uncertain times. These memories helped preserve older attitudes long after society had started to change. The Victorian era also left behind an enormous collection of photographs, diaries, newspapers, and personal letters. Through these records, historians can glimpse the thoughts and concerns of ordinary people. Again and again, they find evidence that health, respectability, and prosperity were closely connected in the Victorian mind. Appearance was not viewed as a separate issue. It was linked to nearly every aspect of daily life. When modern readers study these documents, they often discover how different Victorian priorities were from those of today. Many people spent far less time worrying about achieving a particular body shape and far more time focusing on practical concerns such as employment, family responsibilities, and maintaining good health. Physical appearance mattered, but mainly because it reflected these larger realities. The Victorian story also reminds us that every generation believes its own standards. Make sense. People rarely stop to consider that future generations may view those standards very differently, just as we sometimes find Victorian attitudes surprising. People living 100 years from now may be equally surprised by modern ideas about beauty, fitness, and appearance. This is one of the reasons history remains so valuable. It allows us to step outside our own assumptions and see the world through different eyes. The Victorians lived in a society shaped by industrial growth, social hierarchy, medical uncertainty, and rapidly changing technology. Their understanding of health reflected those circumstances. What they admired was closely connected to the challenges they faced every day. As we continue exploring Victorian England, we discover that even something as ordinary as body weight can reveal extraordinary insights into the past. It tells a story about family life, economic conditions, medical knowledge, and cultural values. Most importantly, it reminds us that ideas about beauty are never permanent. They evolve with society, changing from one generation to the next. The Victorians simply followed the standards of their time, just as people continue to do today. By examining Victorian attitudes more closely, we begin to understand how strongly environment influences human beliefs. People do not develop their values in isolation. They are shaped by the conditions around them, the experiences of their families, and the expectations of their communities. In Victorian England, concerns about food, health, and social status affected the way people viewed themselves and others. These influences were present in daily conversations, family traditions, and even popular entertainment. Many Victorians measured success through visible signs of stability. A comfortable home, respectable clothing, and a healthy appearance all suggested that a person was managing life successfully. In a society where economic hardship was common, these signs provided reassurance. They represented safety in an unpredictable world. This helps explain why physical appearance carried such social importance. Education also contributed to these beliefs. Schools often emphasized discipline, responsibility, and proper behavior. Children learned not only academic subjects, but also social expectations. They were taught how respectable men and women should conduct themselves. RS, or result. Cultural values were passed from one generation to the next with remarkable consistency. At the same time, Victorian society was constantly changing. New inventions altered daily routines. Scientific discoveries challenged traditional assumptions. And growing cities brought together people from different backgrounds. These developments encouraged new ways of thinking about health and lifestyle. While older ideals remained influential, younger generations increasingly encountered alternative viewpoints. Historians often describe the Victorian period as an age of transition. It was a bridge between older traditions and the modern world. The debate over health, appearance, and body weight reflects this larger transformation. On one side stood long-established beliefs linking fullness with prosperity and well-being. On the other stood emerging ideas about exercise, nutrition, and physical fitness. Both perspectives existed simultaneously, creating a fascinating moment in cultural history. Looking back today, it becomes clear that Victorian attitudes were shaped by circumstances very different from our own. Yet the underlying human desire for health, security, and social acceptance remains familiar. Every generation develops standards that reflect its hopes, fears, and priorities. The Victorians were no different. Their beliefs may seem unusual now, but they were logical responses to the world they experienced. Understanding those beliefs helps us appreciate not only the Victorian era itself, but also the powerful role that culture plays in shaping how people define beauty, success, and a good life. Another fascinating aspect of Victorian society was the importance of public opinion. People cared deeply about how they were viewed by friends, neighbours, employers, and relatives. Reputation could influence employment opportunities, social relationships, and even marriage prospects. Because of this, maintaining a respectable appearance became an important part of daily life. Looking healthy suggested that a person was responsible, hard-working, and capable of managing their affairs properly. Victorian newspapers often discussed social behaviour and personal conduct. Readers encountered articles offering advice on everything from household management to proper etiquette. These publications helped reinforce common cultural values across the country. Even individuals who lived far from major cities were exposed to similar ideas about respectability and health. Over time, these messages became deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. The growth of cities created additional challenges. Industrial centres attracted thousands of workers seeking employment, leading to crowded neighbourhoods and difficult living conditions. In many urban areas, disease spread easily, and access to clean water was not always guaranteed. Under such circumstances, signs of good health were especially valued. A strong and healthy appearance suggested resilience in an environment where many people faced physical hardships. Victorian families often placed great emphasis on caring for one another. Parents worried about their children's health, and relatives frequently offered advice about food and well-being. Family meals served not only as opportunities to eat, but also as moments of connection and support. Sharing food reinforced social bonds and created a sense of stability within the household. As historians study these patterns, they gain a clearer understanding of how ordinary people experienced the Victorian era. The preference for fuller figures was not merely a fashion trend. It reflected deeper concerns about survival, prosperity, and social acceptance. These concerns influenced decisions large and small, shaping the daily lives of millions of people throughout Britain. What makes this subject so interesting is that it reveals how closely beauty standards are connected to historical circumstances. When conditions change, ideals change as well. The Victorians responded to the realities of their own time, just as people today respond to the realities of the modern world. Their story reminds us that cultural values are constantly evolving, influenced by economics, technology, medicine, and social expectations. Through understanding their perspective, we gain a richer appreciation of both the Victorian age and the broader forces that shape human societies across history. By the closing years of the Victorian legacy, society had already begun moving toward a new understanding of health and appearance. Yet many older beliefs remained surprisingly resilient. People continued to admire qualities such as strength, reliability, and stability. While fashions changed, the desire to appear healthy never disappeared. What changed was the way health itself was defined. New medical research encouraged people to think not only about food but also about exercise, hygiene, and overall lifestyle. Victorian doctors did not possess the scientific knowledge available today, but they were increasingly interested in understanding how the human body worked. Medical journals, public lectures, and newspaper articles introduced new ideas to the public. Some experts argued that moderation was important, while others emphasized fresh air, outdoor activity, and proper nutrition. These discussions marked the beginning of a gradual shift that would continue throughout the 20th century. At the same time, many families remained proud of traditional customs. Recipes passed down through generations continued to appear at family gatherings. Holiday meals remained important celebrations of togetherness and gratitude. Food was deeply connected to memory and identity. A favourite dish could remind someone of childhood, family traditions, or loved ones who had passed away. In this way, attitudes toward food involved far more than physical health alone. The Victorian experience also teaches an important lesson about human nature. People often believe that the standards of their own era are permanent and universal. Yet history repeatedly shows that ideas about beauty, success, and health are constantly changing. What one generation praises, another may question. What seems obvious today may appear unusual in the future. This is why historians find everyday life so valuable. Through ordinary details such as clothing, meals, and body image, we gain insight into the hopes and concerns of people from the past. The Victorians lived in a world shaped by industrial growth, social ambition, rapid change. Their preference for fuller figures reflected the realities they faced and the values they held dear. By understanding those values, we come closer to understanding the people themselves. They were individuals striving for security, respect, and happiness in an uncertain world. Their choices were influenced by the circumstances around them, just as our own choices are influenced by the circumstances of today. And in that sense, despite all the differences between their era and ours, the Victorians may not be as distant from us as they first appear. As historians continue exploring Victorian England, they often discover that the era was full of contradictions. It was a period of extraordinary progress. Yet many people still lived under difficult conditions. Great wealth existed alongside deep poverty. Scientific discoveries transformed society. But traditional beliefs remained powerful. These contrasts shaped the way Victorians understood themselves and the world around them. Their attitudes toward body weight reflected this complex reality. For a wealthy family, a large dining room filled with guests could symbolize success and social standing. Elaborate meals demonstrated that the household possessed the resources to provide comfort and hospitality. Meanwhile, a working-class family might view a hearty meal as a reward after long hours of labour. Although their circumstances differed greatly, both groups often associated food with security and well-being. This shared connection helped reinforce the cultural value placed on a healthy, well-fed appearance. Victorian society also placed great importance on self-improvement. Many people believed that education, discipline, and hard work could help individuals achieve a better life. Books, lectures, and newspapers encouraged readers to develop good habits and strong moral character. Health was often discussed within this broader framework. Taking care of oneself was considered a responsibility, and physical appearance sometimes served as evidence of how well a person fulfilled that responsibility. Another interesting feature of the era was the growing fascination with statistics and scientific observation. Governments, doctors, and researchers began collecting more information about population, health, and living conditions. These efforts gradually improved public understanding of nutrition and disease. Although many traditional assumptions remained, society was becoming increasingly interested in evidence and research. This shift would eventually influence future attitudes toward body image and health. Looking back, the Victorian preference for fuller figures may seem unusual, but it reveals an important truth about history. Human values are shaped by circumstances. When food is scarce, abundance becomes desirable. When disease is common, visible signs of health become especially important. The Victorians responded to the challenges of their own time in ways that made sense to them. Their story reminds us that every era develops its own standards and expectations. Those standards are not fixed laws of nature. They are reflections of culture, experience, and social conditions. By studying Victorian England, we gain a deeper understanding of how people adapt to the world around them and how ideas about beauty, health, and success evolve across generations. This makes the Victorian era not only fascinating to study, but also surprisingly relevant to understanding our own world today. As the Victorian period moved further into the past, later generations often remembered it through grand images of elegant clothing, impressive buildings, and strict social customs. Yet the real story was much more complicated. Beneath the formal appearance of Victorian society were millions of ordinary people trying to build secure and comfortable lives for their families. Their attitudes toward health and body weight were shaped by practical concerns rather than fashion alone. Food represented security, and a healthy appearance represented stability in an unpredictable world. Many Victorians experienced events that modern people rarely face. Economic downturns could threaten a family's livelihood, and serious illnesses could spread quickly through communities. In such circumstances, visible signs of good health carried tremendous value. A person who appeared strong and well-nourished inspired confidence. Family members felt reassured when their loved ones looked healthy because appearance often seemed connected to survival itself. The importance of community strengthened these beliefs. Neighbours frequently knew one another well and shared information about local events, illnesses, and family circumstances. People paid attention to changes in appearance because those changes sometimes reflected deeper problems. If someone suddenly appeared thin or weak, friends and relatives might become concerned and offer support. In this way, physical appearance was woven into the social fabric of everyday life. Victorian values also emphasised responsibility and duty. Parents worked hard to provide for their children, and many took pride in maintaining a comfortable household. A table filled with food symbolised more than wealth. It represented care, effort, and success as a provider. These emotional connections helped make food an important part of family, identity, and cultural tradition. Today, when historians study these attitudes, they see more than a preference for one body type over another. They see evidence of how people adapted to the realities of their time. The Victorian preference for fuller figures reflected concerns about health, prosperity, family well-being, and social respectability. It was a product of the world they lived in and the challenges they faced every day. Perhaps the most valuable lesson is that every generation develops standards based on its own experiences. The Victorians believed their ideals were sensible because those ideals helped them navigate the society around them. Understanding this allows us to view history with greater empathy, rather than judging the past by modern expectations. We can appreciate how people responded to the circumstances of their own era, creating beliefs and traditions that made sense within the world they knew. By the early 20th century, the Victorian world was slowly disappearing, but its influence remained visible in everyday life. People still remembered the values that had guided society for decades. Respectability, hard work, family responsibility, and good health continued to be admired qualities, although ideas about beauty were beginning to change. The belief that physical appearance reflected a person's circumstances remained deeply rooted in public thinking. One reason these attitudes lasted so long was that they were reinforced by experience. Many older Victorians had lived through periods of hardship and uncertainty. They remembered times when employment was difficult to find and when illness could affect entire communities. For them, a healthy appearance was not merely cosmetic. It represented security and resilience. Looking strong suggested that a person was capable of facing life's challenges and providing for loved ones. The rapid pace of change during this period created an interesting contrast between generations. Younger people were exposed to new ideas through schools, newspapers, magazines, and expanding social opportunities. They encountered different opinions about health, exercise, and lifestyle. Some embraced these modern perspectives, while others continue to follow traditional values passed down by parents and grandparents. This mixture of old and new ideas made the period especially fascinating. Historians often emphasize that Victorian society cannot be understood through simple stereotypes. It was a complex world filled with different experiences and viewpoints. Wealthy merchants, factory workers, teachers, farmers, and servants all lived very different lives. Yet many shared similar assumptions about the relationship between health, prosperity, and appearance. These shared beliefs helped create a common cultural identity. Despite differences in wealth and social position, today the Victorian preference for fuller figures serves as a reminder that beauty standards are shaped by history. They are influenced by economic conditions, medical knowledge, cultural traditions, and everyday experiences. What people admire is often connected to what they value most in life. For the Victorians, health, stability, and security were among the highest priorities, and their ideals reflected those concerns. As we continue exploring the Victorian era, we gain a deeper appreciation for the people who lived through it. Their beliefs may differ from our own, but they were responding to the realities of their time. Understanding those realities helps bring history to life, allowing us to see the world through the eyes of those who came before us, and to recognize how every generation is shaped by the circumstances it inherits. As the decades passed, scholars and writers continued examining the Victorian era because it revealed so much about how societies develop and change. They discovered that many Victorian beliefs were shaped by circumstances that modern people rarely experience. When food is not always guaranteed, abundance becomes valuable. When disease is common, visible signs of health become reassuring. These realities influenced countless aspects of daily life, including standards of beauty and personal appearance. The Victorian period teaches us that culture is constantly evolving. Ideas that seem permanent often change as technology, science, and social conditions change. During Queen Victoria's reign, a fuller figure frequently symbolised comfort and prosperity. Later generations would develop different ideals, influenced by new forms of medicine, media, and lifestyle. Neither perspective existed in isolation. Each reflected the world people lived in at the time. One of the most remarkable features of Victorian society was its belief in progress. Many people genuinely believed that education, industry, and innovation could improve the future. New railways connected distant regions. Factories increased production. Scientific discoveries expanded knowledge. These developments created optimism, even as many social problems remained unresolved. Victorians often saw themselves as participants in a rapidly advancing civilization. At the same time, family remained at the centre of life. Parents worked to provide opportunities for their children, and households served as places of support and stability. Shared meals, family traditions, and community relationships gave people a sense of belonging. These connections reinforced cultural values and helped preserve them across generations. Looking back today, the Victorian preference for Fula figures is interesting not because it was right or wrong, but because it reveals how deeply human beliefs are connected to historical circumstances. The people of Victorian England did not choose their standards randomly. Their values emerged from the experiences, challenges, and opportunities that shaped their world. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History shows that every generation views itself through a unique lens. What seems natural and obvious at one moment may appear unusual years later. By studying the Victorians, we gain insight into how societies create meaning, establish ideals, and define success. Their story reminds us that human beings are constantly adapting to changing conditions, carrying old traditions forward while creating new ones. Through understanding their world, we better understand not only the past, but also the forces that continue to shape our own lives today. As historians reflect on the Victorian era, they often conclude that one of its greatest lessons is the importance of understanding people within the context of their own time. It is easy for modern observers to look back and compare Victorian beliefs with contemporary ideas, but doing so can sometimes hide the realities that shaped those beliefs. The Victorians lived in a world that faced different challenges, different opportunities, and different expectations. Their values emerged from those experiences and reflected the society they knew. Throughout the 19th century, Britain underwent extraordinary transformation. Entire cities expanded, industries grew, and millions of people saw their daily lives change in ways previous generations could hardly imagine. Yet despite all this progress, many families remained deeply connected to traditional ideas about health, prosperity, and social respectability. These values provided a sense of stability during periods of rapid change. In a society that was constantly evolving, familiar cultural beliefs offered reassurance and continuity. The Victorian preference for Fula figures can, therefore, be understood as part of a larger desire for security. People admired qualities that suggested strength, reliability, and protection from hardship. A healthy appearance represented more than physical condition. It symbolized success in navigating the challenges of everyday life. For families who had experienced poverty, illness, or uncertainty, these symbols carried powerful emotional meaning. Modern historians also note that beauty standards often reveal hidden aspects of social history. They show what people feared, what they hoped for, and what they valued most. In Victorian England, concerns about health and stability influenced how people defined attractiveness. The ideal appearance reflected practical realities rather than abstract preferences. Understanding this connection helps explain why cultural values can change so dramatically over time. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all is how ordinary these beliefs seem to the people who lived with them. Victorians rarely viewed their standards as unusual. To them, these ideas felt natural and obvious, just as modern societies often take their own assumptions for granted. Victorians accepted the values that surrounded them. This reminds us that every generation is shaped by its historical moment, often without fully realising it. The story of Victorian body image is therefore much more than a story about appearance. It is a story about family, community, health, prosperity, and the human desire for security in an uncertain world. By exploring these attitudes, we gain a richer understanding of the people who lived during one of the most influential periods in British history, and a deeper appreciation for the ways culture shapes everyday life. As we reach the later reflections on Victorian life, it becomes clear that the people of that era were not simply following trends. They were responding to the realities of their world. Every belief, from ideas about beauty to expectations about family life, developed within a specific historical environment. The Victorian preference for fuller figures was one small part of a much larger picture, a picture social ambition, and the constant search for security. Many Victorians spent their lives working toward stability. Parents hoped their children would enjoy better opportunities than they had known themselves. Workers saved money whenever possible. Families built traditions that provided comfort during uncertain times. In such a society, visible signs of success carried great importance. Looking healthy and prosperous reassured both the individual and the community around them. The more historians study Victorian England, the more they discover how interconnected everything was. Health influenced social status. Social status influenced opportunity. Opportunity influenced family life. Even something as simple as a person's appearance could affect how they were treated by others. This interconnected world helps explain why body image held such cultural significance. It was never just about looks. It reflected a person's place within society and the values that society respected. At the same time, the Victorian era reminds us that cultural standards are always changing. The ideals of one generation rarely remain unchanged forever. New technologies, scientific discoveries, and social movements gradually reshape the way people think. The Victorians inherited beliefs from earlier generations and then past, modified versions of those beliefs to the generations that followed. History is, in many ways, a continuous conversation between the past and the future. Today, when we examine Victorian attitudes toward health and appearance, we are doing more than studying an old beauty standard. We are exploring the hopes, fears, and priorities of millions of ordinary people. We are learning how they understood success, how they cared for their families, and how they tried to create meaningful lives in a rapidly changing world. Their story reminds us that every era has its own assumptions about what is desirable and important. Those assumptions may seem obvious to the people living at the time, yet they often appear very different when viewed through the lens of history. By understanding the Victorians on their own terms, we gain a deeper appreciation for both their world and our own. seeing how culture, circumstance, and human experience continue to shape society across generations. Another important reason Victorian ideas lasted for so long was the strength of tradition. Families often passed values from one generation to the next, and children grew up hearing the same lessons their parents had heard. Respectability, hard work, and good health were treated as essential virtues. These beliefs became part of daily life and influenced everything from education to social relationships, because traditions were reinforced at home, in schools, and within communities. They remained remarkably powerful throughout the 19th century. Victorian society also placed enormous value on appearances in public life. Whether attending church, visiting neighbours, or participating in community events, people were expected to present themselves properly. Clothing was carefully chosen. Manners were closely observed, and personal behaviour was often judged according to strict standards. A healthy appearance contributed to this image of respectability. Looking well cared for suggested that a person came from a stable household and followed accepted social values. As the century progressed, Britain continued to expand its influence across the world. Trade brought new products into homes, while technological innovations transformed everyday routines. Yet despite these dramatic changes, many Victorians still viewed life through the lens of familiar cultural beliefs. They measured success not only through wealth but also through reputation, family stability, and visible signs of well-being. What makes this topic especially interesting is how it challenges modern assumptions. Today, people are surrounded by constant messages about appearance through television, advertising, and social media. Victorians lived in a completely different environment. Their standards developed more slowly and were shaped by local communities rather than global trends. As a result, their understanding of beauty reflected practical concerns that were deeply connected to everyday survival and social standing. Historians often describe the Victorian era as a bridge between old traditions and the modern world. It was a time when long-established customs existed alongside rapid innovation. The debate about health, body image, and social respectability was part of this larger transformation. New ideas gradually emerged, but older values continued to influence society for many years. Looking back now, we can say that Victorian attitudes toward body weight were about far more than physical appearance. They reflected economic realities, medical concerns, cultural traditions, and social expectations. Understanding these beliefs allows us to better understand the people themselves. Their choices were shaped by the world around them, just as our choices are shaped by the world we live in today. And that connection across time is one of the reasons history remains so fascinating. By the end of the Victorian legacy, the world was entering an age that would be defined by unprecedented change. New inventions, faster communication, and expanding scientific knowledge were transforming everyday life. Yet despite these developments, many of the values that had guided Victorians for decades continued to influence society. People still admired responsibility, stability, and the ability to provide for one's family. These ideals remained powerful even as attitudes toward health and appearance slowly evolved. One reason Victorian beliefs survived was because they were connected to personal experience. Older generations remembered periods when food shortages, disease, and financial hardship were genuine threats. For them, a healthy appearance represented much more than physical attractiveness. It symbolized safety, comfort, and protection from the uncertainties of life. These experiences shaped how they viewed the world and influenced the advice they passed on to younger generations. The Victorian era also demonstrated how closely social values can influence everyday behaviour. From the clothes people wore to the foods they ate, many decisions reflected larger cultural expectations. Individuals were encouraged to behave in ways that supported the ideals of respectability and self-discipline. Appearance became one of many ways people communicated their place within society. Looking healthy and prosperous often suggested that a person was fulfilling the responsibilities expected of them. As historians continue to study this period, they often emphasize that beauty standards are never isolated from the societies that create them. They are connected to economics, medicine, technology, and culture. The Victorian preference for fuller figures emerged because it reflected the realities of 19th century life in a world where abundance could not always be guaranteed. Visible signs of prosperity were admired and respected. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson from Victorian England is how quickly social assumptions can change over time. Ideas that once seemed obvious and unquestionable can eventually be replaced by entirely different perspectives. Future generations may view modern standards with the same curiosity that we bring to Victorian beliefs today. History reminds us that cultural values are constantly evolving, shaped by changing circumstances and new experiences. The story of Victorian body image therefore offers more than a glimpse into the past. It provides insight into the ways human societies create meaning and define success. Through understanding these attitudes, we gain a deeper appreciation for the people who lived during this fascinating era and for the powerful relationship between culture and everyday life. Their world may seem distant, but the forces that shaped their beliefs continue to influence societies around the globe even now. As the Victorian era became a subject for historians rather than a lived experience, people began to look back on it with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Some remembered it as a time of progress, innovation, and expanding opportunity. Others focused on the hardships faced by workers, the strict social rules, and the inequalities that existed throughout society. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Victorian England was a complex world filled with contradictions, and those contradictions can be seen even in something as simple as attitudes toward body. For many Victorians, life was a constant balance between ambition and uncertainty. Families worked hard to improve their circumstances, hoping to achieve greater comfort and security. Success was often measured by visible signs that others could easily recognise. A respectable home, proper clothing, and a healthy appearance all contributed to a person's reputation. These symbols reassured both individuals and their communities that life was moving in the right direction. The more we learn about Victorian society, the more we understand that appearance was rarely viewed in isolation. It was connected to family, work, health, and social standing. A person's body was often interpreted as evidence of their circumstances, whether those assumptions were accurate or not. This way of thinking influenced countless interactions and helped shape the cultural values of the period. What makes Victorian story so interesting is that it encourages us to question our own assumptions. Every generation believes certain ideas are natural and obvious. Yet history repeatedly shows that standards change. What one era celebrates, another may reject. What seems unusual today may have appeared perfectly reasonable to people living in the past. The Victorians could not know how future generations would judge their beliefs. They simply lived according to the values and knowledge available to them. Their understanding of health reflected the realities of their time, just as modern ideas reflect the realities of ours. This realization helps us approach history with greater empathy and understanding. Ultimately, the story of why Victorians preferred Fuller figures is not really about weight alone. It is about a society seeking stability in a rapidly changing world. It is about families striving for security, communities defining success, and ordinary people trying to build meaningful lives. Through this lens, Victorian England becomes more than a distant chapter in history. It becomes a reminder that human values are always shaped by experience, and that every generation leaves behind clues that help future generations understand how people once saw themselves and the world around them. Another reason the Victorian era continues to attract attention today is because it was a period when the modern world was beginning to take shape. Many of the technologies, institutions, and social ideas that influence our lives can trace part of their history back to the 19th century. Railways connected distant regions. Newspapers reached larger audiences. And scientific discoveries expanded human understanding. Yet, despite these advances, Victorian society remained deeply attached to tradition. Old customs and new innovations existed side by side, creating a fascinating blend of continuity and change. This mixture of old and new can be seen clearly in attitudes toward health. Traditional beliefs about food and physical appearance remained influential, but scientific thinking was becoming increasingly important. Doctors, researchers, and public officials were beginning to study health in more systematic ways. Hospitals improved, public sanitation projects expanded, and governments became more interested in the well-being of their populations. These developments gradually changed how people thought about the body. Even if older beliefs did not disappear immediately, Victorian families often viewed health as one of their greatest assets. A healthy child represented hope for the future, while healthy parents were better able to support and protect their households. Because life could be unpredictable, maintaining good health was considered both a personal and family responsibility. This attitude influenced everything from diet to daily routines. The Victorian emphasis on family helps explain why cultural values remained stable for so long. Parents taught their children the lessons they had learned from previous generations. These lessons were repeated through stories, traditions, and everyday experiences. As a result, ideas about appearance, respectability, and success became deeply rooted within society. Even when new ideas appeared, they often had to compete with beliefs that had been passed down for decades. looking back from the present. It is remarkable how much can be learned from a subject that initially seems simple. A discussion about body weight quickly leads to questions about economics, medicine, social class, family life, and cultural values. This is one of the reasons historians enjoy studying everyday life. Small details often reveal larger truths about the societies that produced them. The Victorians lived in a world that was changing rapidly, yet they sought stability wherever they could find it. Their attitudes toward appearance reflected that search for security and well-being. By understanding those attitudes, we gain a deeper appreciation for the hopes, concerns, and experiences that shaped one of the most influential eras in modern history. As Victorian society continued to evolve, people increasingly found themselves living between two worlds. One world was built on tradition, custom, and long-established social expectations. The other was shaped by innovation, industry, and scientific progress. This unique combination gave the Victorian era much of its character. Individuals often embraced new inventions, while still holding onto beliefs that had guided their families for generations. These overlapping influences affected nearly every aspect of life, including ideas about health and physical appearance. The growth of education played an important role in this transformation. More people gained access to books, newspapers, and public discussions about science and medicine. Information that once reached only a small portion of society became available to a much wider audience. As knowledge spread, people became increasingly interested in understanding how the human body functioned and how good health could be maintained. These conversations slowly influenced public attitudes. Although change rarely happened quickly, Victorian communities remained deeply connected through family relationships, religious institutions, and local traditions. Neighbours often knew one another well and shared common values. Community life provided support during difficult times and reinforced social expectations. In such an environment, reputation remained extremely important. Individuals were often judged not only by their actions but also by the way they presented themselves to the world. Many Victorians believed that outward appearance reflected inner qualities. A healthy and respectable appearance suggested discipline, responsibility, and good character. Whether these assumptions were fair or not, they influenced countless social interactions. People worked hard to maintain positive reputations, because reputation could affect friendships, employment opportunities, and family relationships. As historians examine these patterns today, they see evidence of a society striving to balance stability with change. The Victorians faced challenges that were both familiar and unique. They worried about health, family, and financial security, just as people do now. At the same time, they lived during a period of extraordinary transformation that reshaped the modern world. This is why the Victorian era remains so fascinating. Through seemingly ordinary subjects such as food, appearance, and daily habits, we gain insight into larger historical forces. We see how economic conditions influence cultural values, how scientific discoveries alter public opinion, and how communities preserve traditions across generations. The story of Victorian body image is ultimately a story about people adapting to the world around them, seeking comfort, security, and meaning in a rapidly changing age. As the 19th century drew to a close, many Victorians looked toward the future with optimism. They had witnessed remarkable changes during their lifetimes. Railways connected distant cities. Factories produced goods on an unprecedented scale. And scientific discoveries expanded human understanding of the world. For many people, it felt as though society was advancing faster than ever before. Yet despite these dramatic developments, everyday concerns remained surprisingly familiar. Families still worried about health, financial security, and the well-being of future generations. The Victorian belief in progress encouraged people to improve themselves and their communities. Schools expanded, libraries became more accessible, and public institutions grew in importance. Education was increasingly viewed as a pathway to opportunity. Parents hoped their children would enjoy better lives than they had experienced themselves. This desire for improvement influenced social values and shaped the aspirations of millions across Britain. At the same time, rapid change often created uncertainty. New technologies transformed traditional ways of living, and many people struggled to adapt to unfamiliar conditions. Industrial cities expanded quickly, bringing both economic opportunities and social challenges. Crowded neighbourhoods, pollution, and difficult working conditions remained common realities for large segments of the population. These challenges reinforced the importance of stability and security in everyday life. Health continued to play a central role in Victorian thinking. A strong body was often viewed as evidence that a person was capable of meeting life's demands. Whether someone worked in a factory, managed a business, or cared for a household, physical well-being was closely connected to daily responsibilities. Because illness could disrupt every aspect of life, maintaining good health remained a priority for families throughout the country. Looking back today, it becomes clear that Victorian attitudes were shaped by a unique combination of tradition and change. The people of the era respected long-established customs while simultaneously embracing many of the innovations that would define the modern world. Their beliefs about appearance reflected this balance. They valued qualities that suggested health, prosperity, and reliability, because those qualities helped people navigate an uncertain environment. The story of Victorian body image, therefore, reveals far more than changing ideas about beauty. It offers insight into the hopes, fears, ambitions, and experiences of an entire society. Through understanding these attitudes, we gain a clearer picture of how ordinary people lived during one of history's most transformative periods, and how cultural values continue to evolve from one generation to the next. In the end, the story of Victorian body image is really the story of a society trying to make sense of the world around it. The people of Victorian England did not wake up each morning thinking about history. They were simply living their lives, raising families, building careers, caring for loved ones, and hoping for a better future. Their ideas about health, beauty, and success were shaped by the experiences they faced every day. In a world where food shortages, disease, and financial uncertainty were familiar concerns, a healthy and well-fed appearance naturally became something to admire. As we have seen, the Victorian preference for fuller figures was never just about physical appearance. It reflected deeper values such as security, prosperity, respectability, and family stability. These beliefs were woven into daily life, influencing how people viewed themselves and others. They appeared in family traditions, social customs, medical advice, literature, and even personal relationships. What may seem unusual from a modern perspective made perfect sense within the context of Victorian society. History reminds us that beauty standards are constantly changing. Every generation develops its own ideas about what is attractive, healthy, and desirable. Those ideas are shaped by culture, economics, technology, and the challenges people face during their lifetimes. The Victorians were no different. Their standards reflected their world just as modern standards reflect ours. Perhaps the most valuable lesson is that understanding the past helps us better understand the present. When we look beyond simple assumptions and explore the reasons behind historical beliefs, we discover that people from earlier eras were motivated by many of the same hopes and concerns that influence us today. They wanted security for their families, good health, social acceptance, and the chance to build meaningful lives. So the next time you see an old Victorian photograph, remember that you are looking at more than clothing and hairstyles from another century. You are looking at people shaped by a unique moment in history. People whose values reflected the world they knew and the challenges they faced. Their story reminds us that ideas about beauty may change, but the human desire for health, comfort, and belonging remains remarkably constant across time. And with that gentle thought, we come to the end of tonight's journey into Victorian England. Thank you for spending this time exploring history with me. If you enjoyed this relaxing look into the past, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter. Until then, get comfortable, relax, and drift peacefully into sleep. Good night.